It was a clear Tuesday afternoon when Dr. Amara Washington drove home from her shift at Memorial Hospital. The spring sun warmed her face through the car window as she stopped at a red light, mentally reviewing her patients from the day. As a respected neurologist, her mind was always busy, even after her 12-hour workday had ended. The light turned green, and she continued down Maple Avenue, a tree-lined street in the peaceful suburb where she had lived for 8 years. She was looking forward to getting home, changing out of her scrubs, and enjoying dinner with her husband Michael. The sudden flash of blue and red lights in her rearview mirror pulled her from her thoughts. Dr. Washington checked her speedometer. She hadn't been speeding. She signaled and carefully pulled over to the curb, putting her car in park and placing her hands on the steering wheel where they would be visible. 2 police officers approached her car. Officer Jenkins, a stocky man with a crew cut, came to her window while his partner, Officer Reynolds, stood back near the trunk. "License and registration," Officer Jenkins said sharply, without introducing himself or explaining why he had stopped her. "Good afternoon, officer," Dr. Washington replied politely. "May I ask why I'm being pulled over?" Officer Jenkins's face hardened. "License and registration first, ma'am." Dr. Washington nodded. "I'm going to reach for my purse now to get my license," she explained, moving slowly and deliberately. She pulled out her wallet and handed over her driver's license, then reached to the glove compartment for her registration. Officer Jenkins examined her license with a frown. "This your current address, Amara?" "Yes, sir. I live on Oakwood Drive." "Pretty fancy neighborhood," he remarked with a hint of disbelief in his voice. "What are you doing in this area?" "I'm driving home from work. I'm a doctor at Memorial Hospital." Officer Jenkins raised an eyebrow. "A doctor?" His tone suggested he didn't believe her. Across the street, a few people had stopped to watch the interaction. A woman with a baby stroller had paused, her phone now raised and clearly recording. "I need you to step out of the vehicle," Officer Jenkins suddenly demanded. "May I ask why? I still don't know what traffic violation I committed," Dr. Washington asked, her heart beginning to race despite her calm exterior. "Step out of the car now," the officer repeated, his hand moving to rest on his holster. Dr. Washington felt a chill run through her body. She had heard stories like this before, routine traffic stops escalating without reason when the driver was black. She had hoped it would never happen to her, but here she was. "I'm going to comply, officer, but I would like to know what I'm being accused of," she said, her voice steady despite her growing fear. As she unbuckled her seatbelt, Officer Jenkins suddenly grabbed her car door and yanked it open. "Hands where I can see them," he shouted, as if she had made a threatening move. More people had gathered now. A man from the coffee shop across the street had come outside, phone in hand, also recording. Dr. Washington felt both grateful for the witnesses and deeply humiliated. "I'm being cooperative, officer," she said, slowly stepping out of her car. Officer Reynolds approached now. "Spread your legs and put your hands on the vehicle," he instructed. "This is unnecessary," Dr. Washington said, her professional composure beginning to crack. "I was simply driving home from work." "Do it now, or we'll have a problem," Officer Jenkins threatened, his hand still on his holster. As Dr. Washington placed her hands on her car, she noticed more people gathering. Her cheeks burned with a mixture of fear, anger, and shame. Little did the officers know who they were dealing with, or who her husband was. The spring breeze carried the murmurs of the growing crowd as Dr. Washington stood with her hands on the hood of her car. She felt the eyes of strangers watching her humiliation, their phones capturing every moment. "Officer, please explain why I'm being detained," Dr. Washington said, struggling to keep her voice steady. Officer Jenkins ignored her question. "Are there any weapons or drugs in this vehicle?" he asked instead, his tone suggesting he already expected to find something. "Absolutely not," she replied firmly. "I'm a neurologist at Memorial Hospital. I was simply driving home after my shift." "Right," said Officer Reynolds with a smirk that made Dr. Washington's stomach tighten. "And I'm the mayor." More patrol cars arrived, their lights flashing and drawing even more attention to the scene. 3 additional officers stepped out, watching from a distance as Jenkins began searching Dr. Washington's purse without permission. "This is completely inappropriate," Dr. Washington protested. "You have no cause to search my belongings." Jenkins pulled out her hospital ID badge and studied it. For a moment, his confidence seemed to waver as he saw her credentials and photo clearly identifying her as Dr. Amara Washington, head of neurology. But instead of backing down, his expression hardened. "Could be fake," he muttered, tossing the badge back into her purse. The crowd had grown to at least 15 people now. A teenager shouted, "Why are you harassing her?" before his mother quickly pulled him back. Officer Jenkins turned to Dr. Washington again. "We've had reports of drug trafficking in this area. Your vehicle matches a description." "What description?" Dr. Washington asked, knowing full well her 4-year-old silver sedan was nothing unusual. "I drive this route every day after work." "Ma'am, we ask the questions here." Officer Reynolds cut in, stepping closer. Something in his stance made Dr. Washington's professional calm begin to crack. She had treated dozens of patients who had experienced trauma at the hands of authority figures. She recognized the warning signs of a situation spiraling out of control. "I'm going to call my husband," she said, reaching slowly toward her pocket where her phone was visible. "Hands where I can see them," Jenkins shouted, grabbing her wrist roughly. "You're hurting me," Dr. Washington gasped, the pain from his grip shooting up her arm. A woman in the crowd called out. She wasn't doing anything wrong. "Everyone stay back," Officer Reynolds ordered, turning toward the onlookers with a hand raised. In that moment of distraction, Dr. Washington managed to reach her phone with her free hand. She pressed her husband's contact with trembling fingers and put the call on speaker. "Michael? I need your help," she said, her voice finally breaking. "I've been pulled over on Maple Avenue near 5th Street. The officers won't tell me why they stopped me. They're searching my things without consent, and one of them is physically restraining me right now." Officer Jenkins tightened his grip on her wrist. "Put the phone down now." "Who is this officer?" Michael's deep voice came through the speaker, calm but with an edge of steel. "Officers Jenkins and Reynolds," Dr. Washington answered, reading their name badges. "Badge numbers 4587 and 3219. "Let me speak to them," Michael said. Jenkins snatched the phone from her hand. "Sir, your wife is interfering with police business. We'll have to take her to the station for questioning." "This is Chief Justice Michael Washington of the State Supreme Court," came the measured reply. "You are currently violating my wife's Fourth Amendment rights against unreasonable search and seizure. I'm recording this call, and I expect you to release her immediately." The effect was immediate. Officer Jenkins' face drained of color. His grip on Dr. Washington's wrist loosened as he stared at the phone in disbelief. The crowd had fallen silent, everyone watching as the officer's confidence crumbled before their eyes. "Sir, there must be some misunderstanding," Jenkins stammered, his earlier aggression evaporating. The power dynamic had shifted in an instant, but the damage was already done. The silence that followed seemed to stretch for hours, though it lasted only seconds. Officer Jenkins stood frozen, still holding Dr. Washington's phone, the Chief Justice's voice echoing in the suddenly quiet street. "Officer Jenkins," Michael Washington continued through the speaker, his voice calm but commanding, "I'm going to ask you once more to release my wife immediately and explain your probable cause for this stop." Jenkins looked at his partner Reynolds, whose face had also lost its color. The additional officers who had arrived as backup shifted uncomfortably, suddenly very interested in their shoes. "Sir, we received a report of a vehicle matching this description," Jenkins said weakly, no longer making eye contact with Dr. Washington. "What description exactly?" the Chief Justice asked. "A silver sedan," Jenkins admitted, the flimsiness of the excuse now painfully obvious to everyone present. "A silver sedan, like roughly 30% of the cars on the road." "I see," said Michael Washington. "And was there anything specific about this particular silver sedan that warranted stopping my wife and physically restraining her?" The crowd watched as Jenkins struggled to respond. One of the backup officers, a sergeant based on his uniform, stepped forward and took the phone from Jenkins's hand. "Chief Justice Washington, this is Sergeant Martinez. I just arrived on scene and am taking command of this situation. Please allow me to speak with your wife and address this matter properly." Dr. Washington rubbed her wrist where Jenkins had grabbed her. A red mark was already forming, promising to become a bruise by morning. The sergeant handed her phone back and gestured for the other officers to step away. "Dr. Washington, I apologize for this incident," Sergeant Martinez said quietly, his eyes sincere but also clearly concerned about the growing public relations disaster unfolding before him. Are you all right? Do you need medical attention? I'm a doctor, Sergeant. My wrist is bruised but not seriously injured, she replied, her professional demeanor returning despite the adrenaline still coursing through her body. The crowd had grown larger, with at least 30 people now watching and recording. Someone had brought Dr. Washington a bottle of water, which she accepted gratefully. Officer Jenkins and Reynolds stood by their patrol car, speaking in hushed tones. Jenkins kept glancing nervously at Dr. Washington and the crowd, visibly sweating despite the mild spring weather. May I ask what will happen to those officers? Dr. Washington asked the sergeant, keeping her voice low. There will be a full investigation, ma'am, Sergeant Martinez assured her. We take these matters very seriously. Dr. Washington couldn't help but wonder if that would have been the case if her husband weren't the Chief Justice. How many other people had these officers stopped without cause? How many didn't have the protection of a powerful spouse? Her phone rang again. Michael calling back. I'm on my way, he said when she answered. Are you okay? I'm fine, she replied, though her shaking hands betrayed her true state. Sergeant Martinez is here now. Put him on the phone again, please, Michael requested. As Dr. Washington handed her phone to the sergeant, she noticed a news van pulling up. A reporter and cameraman were already heading toward the scene, drawn by the crowd and the police cars. This was becoming bigger than just a wrongful traffic stop. The public was watching. The media was arriving. And Dr. Amara Washington, who had always preferred to keep a low profile despite her husband's high-ranking position, now found herself at the center of what would soon become a national conversation. Sergeant Martinez returned her phone and instructed the officers to clear the scene. You're free to go, Dr. Washington. Again, I apologize for this incident. As she prepared to get back into her car, Dr. Washington spotted Officer Jenkins watching her, his earlier arrogance replaced by obvious fear. He knew his career might be over. But what struck her most was the realization that without her husband's position, this story could have ended very differently. The thought chilled her more than the officer's actions had. Dr. Washington sat in her car, hands still trembling slightly as she gripped the steering wheel. She hadn't driven away yet. She couldn't. Her mind was racing too fast, her heart still pounding in her chest. The officers had backed off, but the damage was done. She took deep breaths, trying to steady herself as she watched the scene unfold through her windshield. Sergeant Martinez was speaking firmly to Officers Jenkins and Reynolds, who stood with their heads lowered like scolded children. The crowd remained, phone still recording, unwilling to leave until they were sure justice would be served. The news crew that had arrived was setting up equipment, a female reporter already speaking into a microphone while her cameraman captured footage of the scene. A sleek black SUV pulled up behind the police cars, and Dr. Washington felt a wave of relief wash over her. Michael had arrived. Her husband of 15 years stepped out of the vehicle, an imposing figure in his tailored suit. Even without his judicial robes, Chief Justice Michael Washington commanded respect. His face was a careful mask of professional calm, but she could see the tension in his jaw, the controlled anger in his eyes. The crowd parted as he approached. Several people seemed to recognize him, whispers spreading through the onlookers. That's the Chief Justice. That's her husband. Now they're in real trouble. Michael reached her car and opened the door. Amara, he said softly, kneeling beside her. Are you hurt? She showed him her wrist, the red marks now darkening to purple. His expression tightened, but he maintained his composure. I recorded everything after they pulled me over, she told him, pulling up the video on her phone. She had discreetly started recording when Officer Jenkins first approached her window, a habit she had developed after hearing too many stories from friends and colleagues. Michael nodded, stood up, and helped her out of the car. Let's handle this properly, he said, guiding her toward Sergeant Martinez. The sergeant straightened his posture when he saw the Chief Justice approaching. Sir, I want to assure you that this incident will be thoroughly investigated. I would expect nothing less, Michael replied evenly. My wife has video of the entire encounter. I'm sure your officer's body cameras will corroborate her account. At the mention of body cameras, Officer Jenkins's face paled further. Dr. Washington wondered if he had forgotten about the camera or perhaps had hoped to lose the footage later. Of course, sir, Sergeant Martinez agreed. We'll retrieve all footage immediately. As they spoke, Dr. Washington noticed a woman approaching them, a reporter from the news van. She was young, determined, her press badge prominently displayed. Dr. Washington, Lisa Chen from Channel 7 News. Would you be willing to make a statement about what happened here today? Before she could respond, 3 more reporters had approached, drawn by the presence of the Chief Justice at what had initially seemed like a routine police incident. Michael placed a protective hand on her shoulder. My wife has just been through a traumatic experience. We'll be making a formal statement tomorrow, but for now, we're asking for privacy. The reporters persisted with questions, their voices overlapping. Dr. Washington, do you believe you were racially profiled? Chief Justice, how will this affect your views on police reform cases that come before the court? Were you injured during the arrest? Sergeant Martinez stepped in, creating space between the Washingtons and the press. Please give them room. This is still an active police scene. Michael leaned close to Dr. Washington's ear. We don't have to stay here. Let's go home. But something had shifted inside Dr. Washington. The fear was subsiding, replaced by a growing determination. She thought about all the times she had heard patients, friends, and colleagues describe similar encounters, ones that didn't end with officers backing down because of who their spouse was. No, she said quietly. I want to make a statement now. She turned to face the reporters, standing tall despite her exhaustion. What happened to me today happens to Black Americans every day, she began, her voice growing stronger with each word. The only difference is that I have protection most people don't have. Michael squeezed her shoulder supportively as cameras flashed and microphones pointed toward her. In that moment, Dr. Amara Washington made a decision. This wouldn't be a private incident to be quietly resolved. This would be a catalyst for change. Dr. Washington's impromptu press conference lasted only 5 minutes, but her words were powerful. She spoke clearly, her medical training helping her remain composed despite the emotional storm inside her. The cameras captured every word as she described being pulled over without cause, searched without consent, and physically handled when she had done nothing wrong. The only reason these officers stopped their behavior was because of who my husband is, she concluded, her voice steady. That protection shouldn't be necessary for a citizen to be treated with basic dignity and respect. As she finished speaking, a round of applause broke out from the gathered crowd. Michael stood beside her, his face a careful mask of judicial neutrality, but his eyes revealed his pride in his wife's courage. Back at the police vehicles, Sergeant Martinez was on his radio, speaking rapidly to someone at headquarters. Officer Jenkins kept glancing nervously at the news cameras, no doubt realizing his face would be broadcast across the state by evening. Officer Reynolds seemed to be frantically reviewing something on his patrol car's computer, possibly trying to create a plausible reason for the stop after the fact. Chief of Police Davis is on his way, Sergeant Martinez informed the Washingtons as he approached them again. He's requested to speak with you personally. We'll wait, Michael replied, his tone making it clear this wasn't optional for the police department. A young black woman broke away from the crowd and approached Dr. Washington. Thank you, she said simply, her eyes shining with emotion. The same officer pulled over my brother last month. Nobody believed him when he said it was for no reason. Before Dr. Washington could respond, others came forward with similar stories. A middle-aged Latino man described being searched on the same street. An elderly black woman recounted how her grandson had been handcuffed during a routine traffic stop in the same neighborhood. This has been happening for years, the elderly woman said, shaking her head. But nobody with power ever sees it. Dr. Washington felt a heaviness settle over her. This wasn't an isolated incident. This was a pattern, one that the community had been enduring silently. 20 minutes later, a police SUV with the department's emblem on the door arrived. Chief of Police Davis, a tall man with salt and pepper hair, emerged and quickly assessed the situation. He looked displeased at the media presence but maintained a professional demeanor as he greeted the Washingtons. Dr. Washington, Chief Justice Washington, I want to personally apologize for what occurred today, he said, his voice pitched low but still audible to the nearby reporters. I assure you that we do not condone such behavior from our officers. I appreciate that, Chief Davis. Dr. Washington replied, "But an apology to me isn't enough. What about everyone else these officers have stopped without cause? What about the people who don't have the privilege of a high-profile spouse to protect them?" The chief shifted uncomfortably. "We take all allegations of misconduct seriously." "Then you'll have no problem reviewing all of Officers Jenkins and Reynolds' stops and arrests over the past year," Michael suggested, his judicial experience evident in his careful choice of words. "A pattern analysis would be appropriate here." Chief Davis nodded stiffly. "Of course. We're already initiating an internal affairs investigation." As they spoke, Dr. Washington noticed Officer Jenkins being escorted to a separate police vehicle, no longer wearing his badge or gun. Sergeant Martinez was collecting statements from witnesses, and the news crews were conducting interviews with people from the crowd. What had begun as a routine traffic stop had transformed into something much larger, a public reckoning that could no longer be ignored or covered up. "I'd like to see my doctor now," Dr. Washington said, suddenly feeling the full weight of the day's events. Her wrist throbbed, and the adrenaline that had carried her through the confrontation was fading, leaving exhaustion in its wake. Michael nodded, placing a protective arm around her shoulders. "We'll continue this discussion tomorrow, Chief Davis," he said, making it clear that this was far from over. As they walked to Michael's car, Dr. Washington glanced back at the scene. The police, the news crews, the community members still sharing their stories. Something significant had been set in motion, and she knew her life would never be the same again. By the following morning, Dr. Washington's encounter with the police had become the leading story across all major news networks. The video taken by bystanders had spread rapidly across social media, garnering millions of views overnight. The hashtag Justice for Washington was trending nationally, alongside hashtag Police Accountability Now. Dr. Washington sat in her living room, a cup of tea growing cold on the coffee table as she watched the news coverage. The bruise on her wrist had darkened, a physical reminder of yesterday's trauma. Michael sat beside her, his phone buzzing constantly with messages from colleagues, reporters, and concerned friends. "The governor just called," he said, putting his phone down for a moment. "She wants to meet with us to discuss police reform legislation." Dr. Washington nodded, still focused on the television where a panel of experts was analyzing the video of her detention. She watched herself on screen, the calm, professional woman who had been transformed into a suspect for simply driving home from work. "I've received 17 interview requests already this morning," Michael continued. "CNN, MSNBC, Fox News. Everyone wants to hear our story." "Not our story," Dr. Washington corrected gently. "My story. And it's not even just my story. It's the story of countless people who don't have cameras recording or powerful spouses." The doorbell rang, and Michael went to answer it. He returned with Dr. Washington's parents, who had driven 3 hours after seeing the news. "Amara," her mother said, rushing to embrace her daughter. "Are you all right? We were so worried." "I'm okay, Mom," she assured her, though the slight tremor in her hands suggested otherwise. "This is exactly why we were always so strict with you growing up," her father said, his voice tight with emotion. "We knew this could happen, no matter how educated or successful you became." "Charles," Michael's mother chided, "let's not focus on that right now. Amara needs our support." Dr. Washington's phone buzzed with a notification. The hospital administration had released a statement expressing their full support for her and condemning the police officer's actions. Her colleagues had organized a rally scheduled for that afternoon. On television, the police chief was holding a press conference. "The actions displayed in the video of Dr. Washington's detention do not represent the values of our police department," Chief Davis stated, looking uncomfortable in front of the microphone. "Officers Jenkins and Reynolds have been placed on administrative leave pending a full investigation." "Administrative leave?" Dr. Washington's father scoffed. "Paid vacation is what that means." "The department is implementing immediate changes to our training protocols," Chief Davis continued. "And we will be conducting a comprehensive review of all stops conducted by these officers over the past 3 years." The announcement was clearly meant to show that the department was taking the incident seriously, but Dr. Washington couldn't help wondering if such a review would have happened without the media attention and her husband's position. Her phone buzzed again, a message from a colleague at the hospital. "Amara, you're not alone. Jenkins stopped me twice last year. Never filed a report. Would you like me to speak to the investigators? Similar messages have been coming in all morning from friends, colleagues, and even patients who had experienced similar encounters. Each message reinforced what she already knew. This wasn't about one bad traffic stop. It was about a systemic problem that affected countless lives. Michael sat down beside her again. The state attorney general just announced she's opening a civil rights investigation into the department. Dr. Washington took a deep breath. In just 24 hours, her private life had become public, her personal trauma transformed into a catalyst for potential change. Part of her wanted to retreat, to return to the operating room where she felt confident and in control. But another part, a stronger part, knew that she had been given a platform that others hadn't. I think I should do an interview, she said finally. Just one to start. But I want to make sure the focus stays on the larger issue, not just on what happened to me. Michael nodded, understanding exactly what his wife meant. This wasn't about being the wife of the Chief Justice anymore. This was about using her voice for those who had been silenced for too long. 3 days after the incident, Dr. Washington sat across from respected television journalist Diana Reeves in a downtown studio. The interview had been carefully chosen. Reeves was known for her fair reporting and unwillingness to sensationalize stories. The studio lights felt warm on Dr. Washington's face as she adjusted her position in the chair. Dr. Washington, thank you for speaking with us today, Reeves began. I know this hasn't been easy for you. Thank you for having me, Dr. Washington replied, her hands resting calmly in her lap despite her nervousness. Could you take us through what happened that day? Reeves asked. Dr. Washington recounted the events clearly, from the moment she was pulled over to the instant when the officers realized who her husband was. As she spoke, clips from the bystander videos played on screen, showing Officer Jenkins grabbing her wrist and Officer Reynolds standing with his hand near his weapon. What was going through your mind during those moments? Reeves asked when the clips ended. Fear, Dr. Washington answered honestly. Not just for myself, but I kept thinking about my patients. I had surgeries scheduled for the next day. I kept wondering who would take care of them if I was arrested or worse. The camera zoomed in slightly, capturing the emotion in her eyes. Since the incident, over 40 people have come forward with similar experiences involving these same officers, Reeves noted. How does that make you feel? Heartbroken, Dr. Washington said, but not surprised. Every person who has contacted me described the same pattern, being pulled over without cause, searched without consent, treated with suspicion and aggression. The police department has placed both officers on administrative leave and opened an investigation. You think that's enough? Dr. Washington paused, choosing her words carefully. It's a start. But this isn't about 2 officers. This is about a system that allowed their behavior to continue for years despite complaints. This is about who gets believed when they report misconduct. Outside the studio, a small group of supporters had gathered, holding signs with messages like, "Stand with Dr. Washington," and "End police profiling now." The interview was being broadcast live, and watch parties have been organized across the city. Back at the police station, internal affairs investigators were reviewing body camera footage from Officer Jenkins's previous stops. The preliminary findings were troubling. Black and Latino drivers were 6 times more likely to be searched during his traffic stops than white drivers. What do you hope comes from sharing your story? Reeves asked as the interview neared its conclusion. Real change, Dr. Washington answered firmly. Not just policy changes written on paper, but a fundamental shift in how we approach policing. Everyone deserves to be treated with dignity regardless of their race or who they're married to. As she finished speaking, the studio phone lines lit up. Viewers were calling in to share their own stories, creating a powerful ripple effect that spread beyond the initial incident. After the interview, Dr. Washington sat quietly in the green room, emotionally drained but resolute. Her phone buzzed with a message from Michael. You are amazing. So proud of you. Another message came in from a number she didn't recognize. I'm a police sergeant in a different precinct. What happened to you was wrong. Some of us want change too. How can I help? That evening, as Dr. Washington prepared to return to work the following day, she received a call from the hospital administrator. Amara, there's something you should know, her boss said. Since your interview aired, We've received dozens of calls from patients requesting to be transferred to our hospital specifically to be under your care. They say they want a doctor who stands up for what's right." Dr. Washington felt tears forming in her eyes, the first she had allowed herself since the incident. What had begun as a terrifying encounter had transformed into something powerful, a movement for accountability that was gathering momentum by the hour. Meanwhile, across town, Officer Jenkins sat in his living room, watching the same interview. His union representative had advised him to lay low, but as he saw the evidence mounting against him, he began to realize that this time there might be no escaping the consequences of his actions. 2 months after the traffic stop that changed her life, Dr. Amara Washington stood at a podium in front of City Hall. Behind her, a diverse crowd of over 500 people had gathered, holding signs and wearing T-shirts printed with her now famous quote, "Justice shouldn't depend on who you know." The summer heat beat down on the assembly, but no one seemed bothered by the temperature. They were there to witness a moment many thought would never come, the announcement of sweeping police reforms for their city. "Today marks not an ending, but a beginning," Dr. Washington said into the microphone, her voice carrying across the plaza. "What happened to me was not unique or special. What is unique is that people in power finally listened." In the front row, Michael sat proudly watching his wife, who had emerged as an unexpected but powerful voice for change. Beside him were Dr. Washington's parents, her colleagues from the hospital, and representatives from civil rights organizations who had helped draft the new policies. The mayor approached the podium after Dr. Washington finished speaking. "Today, I am signing Executive Order 357, which creates an independent civilian review board with real power to investigate police misconduct," the mayor announced. Additionally, all officers will now undergo mandatory bias training every 6 months, and body camera footage will be reviewed regularly by civilian oversight committees. The crowd erupted in applause. Dr. Washington smiled, but her eyes remained serious. She knew that paper policies alone wouldn't solve deeply rooted problems. As for Officers Jenkins and Reynolds, their fates had been decided a week earlier. The internal investigation had uncovered a disturbing pattern of targeting minority drivers. Over 85% of their discretionary stops had involved Black or Latino drivers, despite the city's population being only 30% minority. More troublingly, the written reports often cited suspicious behavior that wasn't visible in any of the body camera footage. Officer Jenkins had been fired from the force and was facing civil rights violation charges. Officer Reynolds had resigned before the investigation concluded, but was also named in the lawsuit that Dr. Washington had filed against the department. "The settlement money from my lawsuit will be used to establish the Equal Justice Initiative," Dr. Washington explained to the crowd. "This foundation will provide legal representation to those who have experienced similar discrimination but lack the resources to fight back." After the ceremony, as the crowd began to disperse, a young black woman approached Dr. Washington with tears in her eyes. "My brother was arrested by Officer Jenkins last year," she said. "He lost his job and his apartment because of it. The review board is looking at his case now because of you." Dr. Washington embraced the woman, understanding the weight of those words. Later that evening, as Dr. Washington and Michael drove home, they passed the spot where she had been pulled over. The street looked the same, but everything else had changed. "Are you ready to go back to being just a neurologist?" Michael asked, glancing at his wife. Dr. Washington thought about the question. In the past 2 months, she had appeared on national television, testified before the state legislature, and spoken at community events across the city. Her medical practice had continued. She had performed 12 surgeries in the past week alone, but her life had expanded beyond the hospital walls. "I don't think I can ever go back to being just anything," she replied thoughtfully. "What happened that day opened my eyes to how much work still needs to be done." As they pulled into their driveway, Dr. Washington noticed a letter taped to their front door. It was from the police academy, inviting her to be a guest lecturer for their new training program on community relations and implicit bias. "It's a start," she said, showing the letter to Michael. That night, as Dr. Washington prepared her notes for the next day's surgery, her phone buzzed with a news alert. Another city in another state had just announced similar police reforms, citing her case as inspiration. The movement was growing, spreading beyond their city limits. What had begun as a terrifying moment of injustice had transformed into something powerful and enduring. a catalyst for the change that so many had been fighting for over decades. Dr. Amara Washington, neurologist, reluctant activist, and voice for the voiceless, finally allowed herself to feel something that had been missing since that day on Maple Avenue: hope.